So the very first dinosaur whale was Pachycetus. There was another animal called Ambulocetus that roughly lived about 48 million years ago. It got to about 4 meters in length, and it showed a suite of adaptations that allowed it to go from land and into the water as well. It still had 4 legs. And then what we see from the fossil record itself is this incredible transitional series of fossils that show us how these animals basically essentially lost the use of their hind legs, and how they basically developed that fluke, how they streamlined their body, how they telescoped their face, they stretched it out to become the modern ore plan that we can find for whales today in a very short amount of evolutionary time. And it's actually very shocking. Just less than 10 million years, they went from an animal that lived on land to an animal that was almost fully obligately aquatic, swimming around in the ocean with no means of ever going back. And so for me, it represents probably one of the most remarkable phases of evolution that we can possibly think of, because we have the fossils there. They dictate to us exactly how these animals came to be in the marine environment right now. When you look at Ichthyosaurs, for example, marine reptiles that lived right at the beginning of the time of the dinosaurs and died out about 92 million years ago, they don't really have those transitional forms. They just basically see them there, obligately aquatic. They have the fins, they have the nostrils, the top of their head. They look more like a dolphin form than anything else, dolphin equivalent of a reptile, but we don't have those transitional forms. So we're very lucky in the sense that we have enough areas in the globe where we can actually see how whales have evolved over time to change gradually with the conditions.
Okay, so now the big question. How do you know all of that? How do you figure that out?
So when you look at a tooth like this, right, when you look at a single fossil, I don't really consider it to be a fossil anymore. I consider it to be a piece of raw data that I can use as a means to understand the world and the evolutionary spectrum of life itself. So when you look at certain skeletons of whales and you find, yes, Ambulocetus was the 48 million year old walking whale that transitioned and looks more like a crocodile and a whale and an otter as well. You're able to make certain judgment calls on whether or not these animals actually did descend from one another. And I mean, a good analogy that I was given was, imagine if you have the yellow submarine, right? And you have the Batmobile. Imagine if you tried using all the parts of the Batmobile, you try to change it into the yellow submarine. How would you go about doing it? That's what these whales had to do. They lived on land for the longest time. They lived on land for, ever since they walked out of the water when they were fishing. And they were considered distant ancestors to us as well. And then for them to have to change everything about their terrestrial lifestyle, breathing air, you can't just get gills from anywhere. You have to be able to hold your breath. And so they've developed techniques for being able to hold their breath so they can dive down 2 kilometers below the surface of the water. When Pachycetus was standing on the edge of a riverbank, he or she could never have imagined the journey it would have taken on, how he would go on to one day become the biggest animal that had ever lived. It's quite insane. And I know this is a bit of a tangent as well, but I love talking about blue whales because they're just so incredible. Do you have a favorite fact about blue whales by any chance?
I actually don't have a favorite fact. I have a favorite story, because people usually say things about how big a blue whale is, how big the heart is, how big the arteries is, those kind of things. But for me, when I first started doing aerial surveys in a little plane that seated 6 people, and we were not that far up off the water, just enough to not disturb the animals, but certainly not as far as commercial planes go. And I never have told anybody this publicly, but at the time I was terrified of flying. And when I was invited to participate in these surveys, I said, what am I going to do? I'm going to be in this little tiny bubble above the water, not too far. And if I lose it up there, there's nowhere to go. Yeah. That's it. But I said, I don't care. I want to see these animals. We were going to go scout out. So I took a deep breath and I got in the plane, kept it together, and then we got over the ocean. And we were in a plane called a Partnavia. So it's not a big plane. It's a 2-engine for safety, 2 pilots. The windows were changed so that they bubbled out a bit. So we had about maybe 8 centimeters that you could lean into the window and look down. And so we were over the water and 2 blue whales surfaced together. And I remember thinking, those things are freaking huge from up here.
Yeah.
And I still couldn't believe. But then I realized at one point we were flying at a 45-degree angle in a circle around the whales so we could keep up with them and get video and describe their behaviors. And I had my hands on that bubble window, and I was straight down looking at the water, and I wasn't scared anymore because it was so incredibly amazing that I forgot to be afraid.
It's very humbling as well when you do see a whale in the flesh for the very first time. I don't know, when I saw a humpback for the very first time, and I was just like, oh, these aren't even considered to be the biggest whales. This is incredible. Look at the size of that flipper. My God, they're huge. They're just terrifyingly massive. And then you start to realize you're just a very small part in all of this, aren't you?
And humpback whales are my main study animals, and we've been out there during breeding behavior when the female was getting away from a group, and she would spread her flippers and go directly under our boat and then be pursued by up to 11 whales. And I've looked over my shoulder at the interns who were there for a week, turning pale and holding on for dear life to this small 10-meter boat that we were in. But then I looked next to a research assistant, and he and I are holding on to the side of the boat, looking down, going, "This is amazing!" Very excited. and we have many stories like that. I think you would really enjoy being in that kind of circumstance.
I've been on a few whale boats just as a guest before, and you really get taken away. I mean, you look at the bones and things like that, you look at the segments of whale jaw, and you know that they're big animals, but sometimes it kind of takes you to have to be there with the living ones to really realize, oh yeah, they are as big as we think they are. So.
And we get in the water in the Turks and Caicos. That's something that my permit allows us to do. And one of my research assistants, I was on the boat, she was in the water, and I watched from the boat a male humpback whale that was about 200 meters away from her circle around and come right at her. Came to an immediate and sudden stop right beside her where his eye was. Looked her up and down for about 15 seconds. She could have touched that animal, reached out and touched, and then he just swam away. So he came to check her out, and she came to the top of the water, and her mouth, I have photos of her mouth just hanging open, and I can't even imagine how terrifying and exciting that must have been at the same time. And there are some toothed whales I will not get in the water with. Pilot whales are the brats of the sea, and I have seen them antagonized just for what appears to be just for the sake of antagonizing humpback whales. It looked purely like it was entertainment. But I want to get back to you. I mean, you and I are going to talk a lot more after this, but you had to go to school to do this. You couldn't just get off 12th year, graduate school, and then say, I'm going to be a paleontologist. Clearly, you have a lot of education. So for the school kids out there, and for the adults out there that are going to see this, what subjects in school, what did you study that you thought you would never use, and your teacher said, no, you'll use this someday, it's important, that you're actually finding it is important? And what kind of things, was it worth it? All the work, was it worth it?
I get that question a few times. It's pretty stressful at the best of times. I mean, whether or not it's financially rewarding, I mean, I have a job in paleontology in the area that I grew up in, and I get to work on the material that I really want to work on. I'm incredibly lucky and privileged. Subjects, though, statistics was one of them. I hated statistics with an absolute passion. I never saw an interest in it whatsoever. It put me off from doing research completely, but I get it. I understand it. And it's very important to have the basic understandings of numbers and why that's important in the first place. And there are other things as well that I think are equally as important. Being able to just read any scientific article that's given to you and being able to formulate a judgment and being critical about what's on the piece of paper. Because in paleontology in particular, there are lots of different fields within you look at whales that disagree with each other about the evolution of whales, and looking at the literature, you wouldn't really know that unless you were being really critical of the material that's out there in the first place.